Welcome, everyone. It's my great pleasure to offer this webinar today, and in particular to introduce Dr. Bill O'Hare, who's going to be presenting on it. Dr. O'Hare has been working in this arena and has more than 40 years of experience in statistical analysis of social and demographic data in various settings. I could read you his whole resume, but what you really need to know about him more than anything else in this context is first that between 1993 and 2005, he ran the Kids Count project at the Annie Casey Foundation. That project works with national data and state data on child well-being and with data groups working in all 50 states. He published an annual data book. He ran the grants to the 50 states, and he represented the foundation in many forums. After he ran that project, he worked from 2011 to 2013 as a fellow at the Census Bureau, where he was specifically studying the undercount of young children in the census. And he really is a nationally known expert on this topic. And he is doing some of his work on this project that he'll talk to us about today in partnership with people from the Population Reference Bureau, which is another place he had worked before he went to Kids Count. So he brings to the work that he's going to talk about today both a huge depth of experience and understanding of the policy implications and partners who are exactly the right people to be working with him on this issue at this time. So having said that, I'm going to turn the webinar over to him. And Bill, please take it away.
Well, thank you very much, Deb. Can you hear me all right, or is there any way to tell?
Yes, you sound fine.
Okay, great. Well, thanks for the opportunity, and thanks for all of you for joining in to talk about this topic of the undercount of young children in the census, a topic that I've been very focused on for the last several years, and a topic I think has largely been overlooked in a bunch of spheres, including the Census Bureau. So I appreciate the opportunity to talk a little bit about it today. I'm going to first talk a little bit about why counting young children in the census is different than counting other populations, and go through several reasons why that's the case. And I think that lays the ground for why we need a little different approach, a little different methods for trying to make sure we get an accurate count of young children in the 2020 census. And then a little bit about why the current ways we have available to identify hard-to-count areas in the 2020 census will not work very well for young children. And at the end, provide a bit of an overview of a project that I'm involved with that's being run out of the Population Reference Bureau in Washington to try and develop a better measure for identifying where hard-to-count areas are likely to be for young children in 2020, so we can use that tool or that metric to focus our attention in 2020 in the right places. Here's a list of 6 different reasons why young children are different than other populations in counting in the census. And you can read these as well as I can read them to you, so I'm not going to read them here. But I am going to go through each one in a little bit of detail to try and give you a better sense of why young children are different than other populations. And hopefully by the end of this, you might not have a clear vision of all 6 reasons, but hopefully you'll have a better sense of why young children need some special attention and special metrics for identifying where we should focus our attention in the 2020 census. So let me start with this reason. Young children have a higher net undercount than any other age group, including older children. And this graph is one from the 2010 census. It shows the net undercount of age groups by 5-year age groups. The lines that go up from that central axis are overcounts, and the bars or lines that go down from that central axis are undercounts, net undercounts. And as you go from left to right across this chart, it goes from the very youngest children, 0 to 4, to the oldest people, 85 plus. And you can see on the far left-hand side for people aged 0 to 4, there's a net undercount of 4.6%, circled there in that blue oval. You can see the next highest net undercount are children 5 to 9 at 2.2%. After that, no age group has a net undercount higher than 0.7%, very small. So the point here is, of all the ages in the 2010 census, young children had a net undercount higher than anybody else, not only higher, but higher by far than any other age group, and the only one close was 5 to 9, so young children in general have a much different experience in the census than older age groups. In fact, you can see for 18 to 24, they're kind of the college-age population, and then for older people, 50 plus, there are net undercounts in the census. No, I'm sorry, net overcounts in the census. So many groups are being double counted while young children are being missed. This is another way of looking at how the net undercount of young children compared to other groups. The bars that go to the right of that central axis are overcounts, net overcounts, I'm sorry, and the bars that go to the left are net undercounts. And at the very base of that chart, there's a net undercount for young children, 4.6%, just like we saw on the previous slide. And again, none of the groups here have net undercounts that even approach the net undercount of young children. Hispanics and blacks have net undercounts of 1.5%, 2.1% from this methodology. Native Hawaiians, 1%. Males are undercounted, females are overcounted, renters are undercounted, owners are overcounted. There's some differentials there, but nobody, I'm sorry, I didn't say nobody, no other group, no other demographic group, major demographic group has a net undercount even approaching the net undercount of young children. So the first reason young children are different than other groups is they have a much higher net undercount than other groups. A second reason young children are different than other groups is that the net undercount of young children has been growing while the net undercount for adults has actually been improving. In other words, the accuracy of adults has been improving. This is a chart that shows the net undercounts and overcount rates for adults from 1950 to the 2010 census. The red dotted lines are adults age 18 and over, and the blue solid line are children age 0 to 4. And as you can see, from 1950 to 1980, those net undercount rates were not too different, and they were both improving over that period. So there was no particular reason during that period to look at young children relative to other groups. But after 1980, there has been a real strong divergence in the trajectory of young children and adults in terms of census accuracy. From 1980 to 2010, the net undercount of young children plunged from 1.5% to 4.6%, tripling. At the same time, the net accuracy for adults improved to the point that in 2000 and 2010, there were slight overcounts for the adult population. So the trajectory of young children over the last almost 40 years now is very different than the trajectory of adults over that period. And I'll add, just as a side note, the recent report from the Census Bureau that looked at data from 2009 to 2014 in the American Community Survey shows that the coverage of young children continued to deteriorate after 2010. So the last data we have available suggests that this problem of the undercount of young children has gotten worse since 2010. The point being that if we want to make any difference in 2020, we really have to focus on what we can do to turn around the current trajectory. This is data from 1990 to 2010 census for young children, represented by the blue dashed line, and several race groups represented by other lines. And the point is that between 1990 and 2010, the net undercounted young children worsened, as we saw on a previous slide. In this case, it worsened from 3.7% in 1990 to 4.6% in 2010. Over that same period, the net undercounts for all these other racial groups improved, particularly between 1990 and 2000. So even in the short run, while the net undercounted young children has gotten worse, the net coverage for other race groups has gotten better. Another reason why young children are different than other populations in terms of being counted in the census. The third reason that young children are different is kind of related to the one we just talked about, but it's also related to the fact that those trends occurred while the per household expenditure by the Census Bureau increased. And let me show that graphically. I think it'll be simpler. So the blue line in this graph is the cost per housing unit in standard dollars, is taken from the National Academy Science Report. I think the standard dollars were 2009, but that really doesn't matter too much. I put the per household cost the Census Bureau spends on the census relative to what it spent in 1960. So 1960 was 1, and by 2010, they spent 6.8 times as much as they did in 1960 in a per household basis. And particularly since from 1990 to 2010, the cost increased dramatically. And the point is, as those costs increased, particularly between 1990 and 2010, the net undercount for blacks, the gray dotted line, improved. In fact, it improved dramatically from 5.5% in 1990 to 2.5% in 2010. But over that same time, as the household expenditures, per household expenditures increased, the undercount of young children went down. So even though the Census Bureau was spending more money per household to get more accurate counts, it didn't have a positive impact on the undercount of young children. And that's another reason why young children are different than other populations. The fourth reason I want to talk about, it may be one of the key reasons, I guess, that we need to think more seriously about how to count young children and the methods we're using to reach them and get them counted, is that young children are missed because they are more likely to be left off of return census questionnaires. Let me just move ahead here. There's a couple studies that just came available in the last couple of years, and I can explain the methodology, but I'm just going to go to the bottom line, that the data from those studies suggest that about 80 to 85% of the young children missed in the 2010 census were living in households that returned a census questionnaire, in the obvious implication being that young children were missed because they were left off those questionnaires. And just to be a little clear here, most often it's not only the young child that was left off, but other people in the household, including, for example, the mother of a young child. And so the point is that young children are not missed because their household didn't return the census questionnaire. They're missed because they were not included in a questionnaire that was returned by a household. And I think that's a very different problem and requires some different messaging than trying to get households to respond, which is the typical message from the Census Bureau. A fifth reason why young children are different than others is a little bit more difficult to quantify, but I'm convinced it's true, that the reason young children are missed and young children being missed don't fit neatly into the kind of paradigm that Census Bureau, and for exact more than the Census Bureau, survey researchers in general tend to use. Here's a list of 5 different reasons why people are missed in census and surveys by 2 different experts, such Roger Tarango in a book in 2004, and then the Census Bureau presented similar data in 2018. And if you look at these and try and see which one explains why young children are left off census questionnaires, none of them really focus on that issue. And in fact, there's another aside. What makes this undercount of young children in the census particularly vexing is that in survey research generally, households with young children are more likely to respond than households without young children are more likely to be contacted than respond. And one of the reasons for that is pretty obvious, I guess, that households with children, particularly with young children, are more likely to be home. And they're also probably more likely to be engaged in civic kinds of activities and being looking at elections and at school systems and parks and ways to help their communities. So the point is, the undercount of young children in the census is inconsistent with how households with children are represented in most surveys. And as I point out here, another reason that young children are different than other populations is they don't fit neatly into the standard paradigm used by the Census Bureau and others for why people are missed. A final reason that I think young children are different is they've been largely overlooked in the Census Bureau's communication plan, particularly in the past, but even in 2020. But if you go back to 2010, as I spent some time right after 2010 and looked at the material the Census Bureau produced regarding the 2010 census, you'd have no glimmer that young children were the group that was missed the highest as they were in 2000. So it's not just a recent phenomenon that this high undercount of young children, as we've seen, has been in existence at least since 1990, and yet there was virtually nothing about the undercount of young children in the 2010 census. And to some extent, that's been carried forth to 2020. I just cite a couple of the things. I'll let you read these more than I'll talk about them, but the chief effort the Census Bureau uses to do audience research for reaching out and communicating with the 2020 census is a survey called CBAMS, which stands for Census Barriers, Attitudes, and Motivation Study. So it's an effort by the Census Bureau to try and get information it can use to hone messaging around the 2020 census. And the second line here says there were 42 focus groups they did last spring. None of them were focus groups with households for young children. The CBAM survey had 61 questions, but none of them were focused on young children. So it was a fantastic opportunity to learn more about why people leave young children off their form, but it was overlooked by the Census Bureau. I'll let the rest of this just sit there, but the point is young children are different because they haven't received the kind of messaging one would expect, given the fact that, or message research and messaging that one would expect, given the fact that young children have a higher net undercount than any other group. Here's a statement from the CBAMS report that says the primary goal of the partnership communication is to motivate self-response in the decennial census. And the point that I made earlier is that self-response didn't help the undercount of young children because most of them were missed in houses that did respond. So there needs to be a secondary message of some type that said not only self-respond, but make sure you include all the young children in your household in that response. And that secondary kind of messaging has been overlooked is maybe the right word, I'm not sure, but it's not evident yet in the Census Bureau material. Okay, this is what I just said, I think. So given that background that young kids had a higher net undercount than any other group, and that it's been getting worse, and that didn't respond to the increased the net undercount, the accuracy of the count of young children, didn't respond to more money from 1990 to 2010, and there has not been very good research on why young children are missed or how to reach them. My point is that we need to find a better metric for 2010 on how to census outreach, that the data and approach currently being used by the Census Bureau and others does not do a very good job of predicting where there will be hard-to-count pockets of young children in the 2010 census. And most of that work that the Census Bureau has done, and I've been involved in something else I'm going to talk about in just a second here, builds off the idea of the mail return rate. And looking at where the mail return rate, just to make that clear, in 2010, questionnaires were sent out to every household, and people were asked to fill them out and send them back in. Those that did it, the percentage of those who did it is the mail return rate, so it's kind of a self-response measure. And looking at the mail return rate does not predict undercount of young children very well, particularly in large counties. I'm going to talk about that in a minute. So the mail return rate, for kind of understandable reasons, that kids are missed not because their household didn't return the questionnaire, but because they were left off the questionnaire. So mail return rates by themselves don't do a very good job of predicting where we're likely to have high net undercounts of young children. As I said earlier, I guess because young children are different, we need a new method and a new metric to identify the places where they're most likely to be missed. So that brings me to the thing I want to talk most about here, or next about, I guess, is that I'm working with the Population Reference Bureau, demographers, on a project that we started this in the fall, but really got involved in the last couple of months, of trying to develop a new metric for predicting areas where young children will be more difficult to count in the 2020 census. And so there's two major parts to this. One is developing the metric and the index and the numbers, and secondly, making them widely available. So I'm going to talk a little bit about both of those, but mostly the first one. I kind of alluded to this earlier, but if you look at the 2010 mail return rate and look at how well it explains the net undercount of young children in large counties, it doesn't do a very good job at all. Just to be kind of brief here, there is a measure that statisticians use called percent of variance explained, and as you can it's kind of a measure of how well one variable explains or predicts another variable. In this case, we're talking about how well mail return rates explain net undercounts for young children across large counties. And the point, and that rate goes from 0, where it doesn't explain any, to 100, where it explains everything, so the higher the better. But as you can see from this first bullet point, the mail return rate only explains about 6% of the variance. So it's a pretty low explanatory level for just the mail return rate. Another measure that's been used, and I've been involved in this a little bit, is identifying the number of children living in hard-to-count census tracts. But those hard-to-count census tracts were identified by mail return rates in 2010. And when you look at the percent of young children in hard-to-count tracts, that only explains about 8% of the variance in net undercount rates in large counties, young children in large counties. So the two major ways in which we are now identifying where to focus attention in 2020 really don't work very well in explaining why some areas are likely to have high net undercounts and other of young children and others aren't. This is another way of kind of showing why we need a new model. The factors on the left are the model that we've developed. Let's call it a preliminary model because we're kind of in the middle of working on this. A preliminary model of explaining net undercounts of county levels and the most important factors. And the list of variables on the right are a list of variables that are used by the Census Bureau in developing what they call a low response score, which is kind of a prediction of the mail return rate. And you can see there aren't very many overlaps. There's not very many variables that are in both those columns. So the columns on the left are the best set of variables that we can come up with to explain differences across counties. And they're quite different than the variables that explain mail return rates. So the major work, as I just kind of alluded to at the Population Reference Bureau, or PRB, is to pinpoint where the messages need to be delivered in 2010. Where are the census tracts, where are the census tracts that are most likely to have a lot of high-risk kids or a lot of young children who are at risk of being missed in the census? And there's several steps where we've done, and in the middle of it, I guess, one is developing a database that has the net undercount for young children in 2010 for all the counties of 100,000 or more population. And we only focus on the larger counties because the net undercount rate for smaller counties for young children is pretty unreliable. And so we wanted to use just the counties that had the most reliable estimates of the net undercount for young children. And then we looked at which variables out of a set of 30 so potential explanatory variables did the best job of explaining or predicting the net undercount across those counties. And we're kind of in the middle of refining those now, but just to go back to that idea of variance explained, if you remember, the mail return rate by itself explains 6% of the variance. The percent of kids in hard-to-count tracts was 8% of the variance. Our estimate explained about 40% of the variance. So we think we are on the trail of a much better predictor of net undercount for children. Our plan is to use these county-level results for the coefficients between net undercounts and different factors like race to produce tract-level data for net undercount estimates for young children in 2020 and to make those available. And as I say, tract-level estimates, I'm not sure we're going to produce the exact estimate. We may well end up putting into a high, medium, low, or something like that, just to because the precision of all those tract-level estimates is likely to be problematic. And so we're not quite sure what that will look like. But in the end, we will develop a database and make it available that will show people where are the most problematic areas for young children like to be in the 2020 census. We're going to be disseminating that data widely. This has not been, everything hasn't been firmed up, but at least these 5 different areas of dissemination will be used. I think that will cover a lot of the kind of people that we want to get this information. And I'm pretty sure that as this evolves, we'll probably find other partners to disseminate this information through. And so we hope people will be able to take our metric and probably combine it with some other local data that our estimates are based on national relationships. And so it's always wise to make sure you use whatever local information you have. But I think our metric will be a very good starting point for trying to figure out where to invest in young children. Let me back up before I read the summary. That our timetable is roughly having this data available by late spring, and that I mean by May or June is kind of what we're talking about. I know it's already late. We'd like to have this already available, but we also need to make sure we spend the time and effort needed to make sure it's as good as we can do in the time frame available. And so we're struggling against those 2 factors, I guess, of trying to get it as soon as possible, but making sure it's as useful as possible. And so hopefully we'll have this new metric available by the spring, and we hope that some people who are thinking about funding activity regarding young children can wait that long to identify where young children are going to have the highest net undercounts in 2020 without intervention. So that's kind of a footnote to what I just talked about. So finally, let me tell you what I think I said and see if it's what you think you heard. Counting young children in the census is different than counting other populations, and I went through that, and I don't expect you to remember all the details, but I hope you were convinced that young children are different than most other populations in terms of their ability to be counted in the census and what we need to do to reach them. I think reducing the net well, let me back up one other thing, point that I want to make sure is clear. That young children have a higher net undercount than any other age group and any other race group. And so given that fact, we believe that young children deserve a special attention in the 2020 census in terms of outreach and promotion. And so we should be focusing our attention on this group that's the hardest to count group. Because they're different, the undercount of young children requires a different approach than those for the other group. And our outreach efforts for households to young children had largely been overlooked by the Census Bureau, although I will say that in the last couple of months, I'm gratified to see that they're starting to pay more attention to this, and I think there's some things that they may well do in the 2020 census that will help. So I don't want to be completely negative about that, but I have been frustrated by the lack of attention in the past. And finally, what I kind of all lead it up to, I guess, I think we need a special metric or a special index or a special way to identify the areas where young children will be most difficult to count the 2020 census, and that's what we're working on. This is my contact information. I'm happy to talk about this with anybody at any time, so please feel free to contact me.
Great. Bill, thank you so much. Well, first of all, let me say, if you have questions for Bill, please put them in that chat box on the lower left part of your screen. You need to type the message and then select a chat recipient, and I suggest you either select everybody or all the co-presenters, and then Bill can answer it out loud. But we usually find that taking written questions helps so that people don't end up talking over each other. Bill, thank you so much for taking everybody through that. I do want to flag 2 things for our audience. One is that the Count All Kids project is also doing message research on why families leave young kids off the census form and what messages will persuade them to count them. We're doing that in large part with support from Richard Thomason and the California Blue Shield Foundation, for which we're extremely grateful. And that research will also become available in the late spring, along with communications materials built off that message research that people can use to target families with young children. So this is a kind of combined approach with Bill and the Population Reference Bureau doing the research on where the kids are, and we're doing the research on how do you persuade families to make sure they count those kids. Having said that, I would love to take questions from anybody about anything Bill's talked about. I do want to flag for you that it's really important not to lock your plans in until you've got Bill's metric. It really does look like there are going to be areas that are not in the Count All Kids, the Hard to Count maps, that you're going to want to do some outreach to. And if you can keep some flexibility on where you're going to target areas, you'll be able to do a much better job of counting kids. Bill, we have a question from Richard. Do you have a sense of how different will be the list of hard-to-count census tracts for young kids versus the list of hard-to-count tracts that we already have? And any hunch about, this says when those two lists will differ, but Richard, I'm wondering if you mean why or where, because our list will be out in late spring.
As you just said, Debbie, our list will be out in the late spring, and another piece of information here, the census has a planning database which includes their low response scores. The next version of that is supposed to be released in April. So I think to look at where our data suggests different places than the regular data, we'll be comparing that April list to ours. I'm not really sure how different ours will be. I suspect, we know there are some places where there probably will be hard to count folks who don't have a lot of kids. And of course, our metric would not reveal those places. So I suspect there'll be some differences there in terms of particularly impoverished elderly populations. But it's a empirical question, and I don't have a really good answer at this point.
Great. And I would imagine that's also true for some of the college and sites. There wouldn't be many young kids there, but there might be a lot of hard-to-count people. And are there areas that you think are likely to have a lot of young kids that wouldn't be in the hard-to-count map? Are there particular factors for that? And then I have a question from Sheila that I'll ask you after that.
I really haven't thought about that enough yet to give you a solid answer for that. I've been so busy with some of the metrics here that I haven't had time to think about the big picture, I guess. So I don't really want to offer a unthoughtful response.
Okay, so Sheila asks, what kind of local data would be useful to pair with the predictive data that you're going to produce?
Well, there's two parts to this. One is, of course, the data like the Kids Count folks produce all the time that has measures of well-being on children, poverty, and race, and program recipiency and stuff. The other part of this that I didn't really talk about, and I hesitate to talk about it because we are not sure what we're going to do. By we, I mean the folks at the Population Reference Bureau and myself, about making the detailed data available that we base these predictions on or these estimates on, that ultimately we'll probably have 7 or 8 variables in our predictive equation. And in addition to producing the result of the equation, that is the net undercount rate for a tract, we may also make each of those predictive variables available so you can look at which of those seems to be the most driving factor in a given census tract or a given place. That's one example of local data. Just to make this clear, I guess, so I'm not sure if we'll put up that database. Not part of it's just money, that it takes a lot of effort to put it in place and to manage it and so on. The other part is that, census tract data from the American Community Survey is available on the Census Bureau website. So if you're interested in a given county, say Los Angeles County, you can go and get the number of poor black kids or the number of single-parent families or the number of people receiving food stamps in a given tract. Those are the kinds of things that might be useful to add information to our estimates, so you get a little more complete picture of the situation in a tract that has a high net undercounted estimated high net undercounted young children.
I should add to that the Count All Kids project and the partnership and Kids Count project at the Casey Foundation. We're in the process of offering 3 webinars on activities to count kids in particular states around the country. We have one webinar tomorrow and one webinar on Monday. And in the webinar on Monday, the Kids Count grantee from Mississippi will be specifically talking about the kinds of local data they've used to figure out where young kids might be missed. So even if you can't join that webinar, it may make sense to register for it and get the recording, because that will offer some additional guidance. And when I send out the recording and the slides from today's webinar, I'll make sure to send the registration links for both of those webinars, as well as the recording link to the one we already had. Does anyone else have any more questions? I'm going to give everybody a minute or two to respond. Bill, I know when we first talked about this, that this was really, the sort of assumption was that the kids were going to be in the hard-to-count tract where everyone was. This has really been kind of a surprise in your research, right, that it turns out that's not the case.
Well, if I understand what you're saying from a statistical point of view, I guess I'm surprised at how poorly the low response score and the percent of kids in hard-to-count tracts predict net undercounts across the counties. That was surprisingly low to me, and I think it underscores the need for a more child-focused measure on undercount. As I kind of said earlier, the fact that kids are left off, largely in this because they're left off return forms, presents a different problem than trying to get people to respond and return the forms.
Right. And that's something we've had a lot of conversations with Census Bureau staff around, the need both to look in different areas and to do different messaging. And as you said, while it has been frustrating in the past, they are starting to take some steps, which is an exciting development to see. We hope they keep that up. We have 2 more questions here. One is from Sheila. Can you give us a preview of the types of variables you may use in your model that do help explain the variance?
Sure. A couple of, the 4 of them really popped out in the first one, and this is all preliminary, so don't hold me to this, but the most powerful prediction was the number of kids in racial ethnic minority families, that is any family other than non-Hispanic white, was one of the most powerful variables. And that's even after controlling lots of other variables, if control means something to you. So it's after you control for poverty and education and employment and all those other things. The fact that there are clusters of kids in minority families is important. A second one that's kind of similar, I think, is the kids in families where no adult over 14 speaks English well. Linguistically isolated is a term that used to be applied to that. So I'm sure these are new immigrant families. And so places that have a lot of young kids in new immigrant families tend to have high net undercounts. Another couple of them were kind of related to complex families, which is a term that's come up a lot in some of the recent Census Bureau. Hello?
Yeah, we're there.
Okay, I lost my pictures went out in my computer. And so kids living with grandparents and then kids living with unrelated people popped out as important predictors. So I think there's probably going to be something about complex families that will emerge as an important predictor in here. So those are some of the kinds of things we've been using. I'm surprised that things like poverty and education didn't prove to be statistically significant when we looked at these other things. So that's a little bit of a surprise from the general understanding of undercounts.
Great. Matthew has a question that I'm actually going to try and answer. And that question is, if a census participant forgets to include their child on a return form, paper or electronic, will it be possible for them to submit a correction, or are submissions final? And that's actually a really good and really timely question. And it's one we're in the middle of having some conversations with the Census Bureau about. I should add that this would apply not just where somebody forgot a child, but also where, for example, the head of the household, the primary residence renter or owner, filled out the form but didn't include the child and some other family members that they don't really think of as being part of their family. So maybe it's family members who lost their apartment and are temporarily staying in the household while they look for a new apartment, or maybe the person who fills out the form, his girlfriend and her kids stay there, but he doesn't really think of them as part of his family. What happens if that person fills out the form but doesn't include the child, or doesn't include the child and some other family members for that child? We think that it should be possible for people to fill – they can't go back into the original form, which has a very specific – and I'm not sure exactly how it's branded, but the particular initial paper that they're going to get from the Census Bureau directing them to fill it out online, or the actual paper form is kind of coded uniquely to that residence. They can't go back in and open that, but there's a separate process for filing that doesn't have to be done with that code, where you don't have to be at home, you don't have to have the paper in front of you, and we think they should be able to file that to make sure that their family got counted. We've asked the Census Bureau to confirm that, and they are currently in discussions, and what I'm really hoping is they'll come out with a really clear protocol, and then we'll be able to put together a fact sheet that not only covers that, but a lot of other questions that might come up when families are not sure how to get their kids counted, and put that out broadly for everyone to use. In that context, I should say that the Census Bureau and we are jointly planning a webinar, which hasn't been scheduled yet, where they will walk us through the operations of the census, specifically with a view to the areas that have an impact for young kids. And we're putting together a list for them of all of those questions about young kids that we want the webinar to address. Once the webinar happens and those questions are addressed, we'll also take those questions and put them in a fact sheet to make sure that the people who are doing the outreach work know exactly what to tell families to make sure their kids get counted. So the answer is, yeah, I believe they should be able to submit a separate form, but we don't have formal confirmation of that yet. Bill, I think the next one really is for you. Casey Patterson says, can we assume that the net undercount percentage of young kids can be applied across demographics? In other words, if black folks were undercounted by 2.5%, can we expect that within that undercount, 4.6 of those were young kids? And if not, how can we determine disparity by race and ethnicity to help us think about more targeted communications efforts?
There's kind of two questions, or maybe two answers that have come up in that question. I guess one is that at the national level, the net undercount for all kids was 4.6%. For black kids, it was 6.5%. For Hispanic kids, it's about 7.5% initially. So black and Hispanic kids have a much higher net undercount than all kids. There isn't data for other racial groups like Indians and Asians from the Census Bureau. So that's one answer to your question, that young minority kids, black and Hispanic anyway, have higher net undercounts than average. The other kind of question you may be asking here is that if, for example, black kids are 50% more likely to be undercounted than average kids, could you take that net undercount, say in Los Angeles, and make up, say if it was, I'll say it's 5%, and then assume that black kids are 20% higher, or 50% higher, whatever I said. That's not. It could be done, but it's probably full of potential problems. So I just want to make sure that on the national level, we know black kids and Hispanic kids have higher net undercounts in total. When you try and take that down to a local level, where it's more suspect, it's uncertain. I think it's fair to assume that black and Hispanic kids have higher net undercounts than average, but exactly how much higher is probably problematic to predict.
Bill, do we have that data at the state level?
The racial data?
Mm-hmm.
No. Okay. There is some data for Hispanics because it's complicated. There are state level data for Hispanics, but not by race.
But I think, so thank you. I think what we do know is that young kids of color are at higher risk of being missed. And so if you know where those young kids of colors are, you do want to use that as one of your factors in figuring out areas to target. I mean, I think even if we can't give you a precise number of how much they were undercounted or at risk of being undercounted, you still know that that's a high priority. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, I think that's we're talking about local data. That's another place where local data could probably shape what your thinking is about a given area.
Okay. We have a question from Kendra Rogers. Some communities are using birth data for that year to inform their census count for newborns. Do you recommend that as a best practice? Bill, I'm not sure I understand that. She may be referring to birth.
Well, I think she's saying if Los Angeles knows how many kids were counted in 12 months before April 1st, 2020, that should tell them or could help them figure out how many people less than one there should be in the census count. There's a couple issues. One, of course, people move. So somebody born in Los Angeles County may move, or vice versa. People move into Los Angeles County born somewhere else. So that's a bit of a problem. This is not so much let me state this now to see if I can figure out exactly how to couch it. Some recent data from the Census Bureau from 2010 showed that for kids born in January, February, and March of 2010, the net undercount rates were in the neighborhood of 20 or 25%. So a lot of people with very young children don't get included in the census. And so for the whole year prior to the census, it may be risky, but the 3 months prior to the census, I think would give you a pretty good idea of how many people less than 3 months old should be in the census. And in the census, they do ask about the birth date. So if you know someone's age 0 and has a birth date of January 2020, they were born in 3 months prior to the census. I'm not saying that very clearly. So I think there is some use for that birth data. I don't know. I guess I'm a little bit surprised that the birth data would be available that quickly in a locality, but I would be a little bit circumspect, I guess, of using 12 months of birth data to make some kind of estimate exactly how many young children there should be because of the mobility problem and because of the undercount problem.
So it just does highlight, though, the idea that working with maternity wards and OBGYNs might be a good way to pick up those very young children who aren't otherwise getting counted. I mean, speaking as the parent of 2 kids, I know that the first 3 months after I had a child, some days we were lucky to get dinner on the table. It's just overwhelming, and so I'm not surprised that their census forms don't get filled out. It may be a good way to elevate the importance of that by working with midwives and OBGYNs and maternity hospitals. I noticed, Kendra and Casey, that you both had your hands up, and we've just taken your questions in written form. If you didn't get your questions fully answered, by all means, please go ahead and put them in again. It may be a good time while you're thinking about that to point out that the Census Bureau has said that they're going to try and give us immediate data as the census is going on about response rates. So that's I know something that California is already looking at as a way of improving its get out the count efforts between April and June in 2020, and I just want to kind of lift that up as another way of thinking about really immediate data that you can use to get out the count efforts for kids working well. Does anyone else have any?
Let me just add a note to that what they're going to give you is the mail return rate, people who sent back their forms. But remember that most kids are missed on forms that are returned. So I think it's a good effort to get people to respond, but I'm not sure it's going to be that helpful in targeting where there's likely been undercounted young children.
Oh, that's a good point, Bill. Thank you. I'm going to give everybody a moment to ask any more questions. And while they do that, I want to thank you, Bill, for doing this webinar. I do want to say that we are going to offer another webinar on this once the metric is ready to walk everybody through what it's turned out to be, how to use it. I'm hoping that at that point that Bill and Linda and Mark and the other people at the Population Reference Bureau will have maybe been able to do some additional thoughts about how you could supplement it with local data. And so we will offer that once it's ready to help you with your work. In the meantime, as you do your planning in California, please keep in mind that that tool is coming and that you want to incorporate it into your plans. We do have another question here, and this is from Sheila. What started happening in the 1980s and after that you believe led to the higher undercount of young children? Wondering if it tracks to more challenging and costly housing situations. Bill, do you
It's a great question, and I don't have a good answer. I've raised this in other places. I don't know what happened. I've never seen a very convincing argument about why things started to go to pieces. And of course, there've been more complex families since 1980. There's been an increase in Hispanics, which are a hard to count group, but none of that feels very satisfying to me, and particularly, some of those trends should affect adults as much as children. So I don't have a good answer to that.
But it's possible your metric will start putting us on the path to figuring that out, I suspect. It may flag some factors that we have not been looking at that may help us figure it out.
I maybe, but I'm not, the question we're addressing is very different than this one about change over time. So I'm not convinced that what we're going to do is going to lead to that. But it is an intriguing, from a philosophical, sociological perspective, and also a perhaps useful one to understand why that rate has gone up so much while the rate for adults has improved.
Got it.
Go ahead. Well, we're talking about philosophical play. Let me just add this, since we got a minute, I guess, that the other thing I didn't show, but there's almost a perfect correlation between net undercount rate and age from age 0 to 17, that young kids are missed very highly. Teenagers, 14 to 17, are actually overcounted. And every year you go up, there's a decrease in the undercount. It's almost a perfect correlation, and things we don't see very often in social science research or demographic research. And I've never seen a good explanation for that association. Why do kids get counted better every year they get older? So as we're talking about philosophical questions, I thought I'd throw that one out too.
Wow. Because some of that, you would think as they get older, their families dissolve and reform and they have more complex families. It's kind of counterintuitive.
In some ways, yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for doing this webinar. Everyone on the call, I really hope it was helpful for you. I will send you the recording and the slides. I will send you the registration links for tomorrow's webinar, Monday's webinar, and the recording for the last one we did. It's Monday's webinar, where there will be another discussion of local data and figuring out where the kids are. And please keep your eyes open both for a webinar that I think we'll be offering in the next month or two with the Census Bureau on these operations questions around young children, and for the webinar we'll offer with Dr. O'Hare in the late spring once the metric is ready to explain how to use it. In the meantime, have a wonderful day, and thank you so much, Bill.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.